Burgundy is special for a lot of reasons, but as you say, if I could just choose one, it would be the diversity. It's that Pinot Noir isn't the focal point, or Chardonnay isn't the focal point. It is what those two grape varieties have to say when grown in a specific plot, in a specific year, made by a specific person. And it is the confluence of those three elements that confer sometimes very, very different characteristics in the finished product. Burgundy tends to flower earlier, tends to pick earlier, and in a region like Burgundy, which is relatively north by the standards of where you can consistently grow red wine, not white wine, but red wine, those days at the end of the growing season become really, really important. You have an instance where, typically at least, less so with climate change, but in the old days, where you routinely had harvests that took place in October, all of a sudden now you've got a circumstance where the days are getting cooler, especially the nights, and also the amount of sunlight during the day is getting shorter. And so in certain cases, like let's just take 2013, which is the first vintage since 1978, where you had a vintage a harvest actually start in October. In certain cases, you could have waited until the 1st of December and not brought in fruit that was any different than you picked in the middle of October. And that's because the sunlight is declining each and every day, and so photosynthetic activity stops. The vines sense that the vegetative cycle is over, leaves drop off, so you're no longer getting photosynthetic activity, and therefore the only maturation that you're getting is through what they call evaporation rather than actual photosynthetic activity that promotes the phenolic ripeness that we're after. So back up, you had a really, really good spring. It was warm, it was almost as though summer had come early. You had a really, really good fruit set. And so the guys in the Côte de Beaune in particular were thinking, this is the answer to our prayers, because after being hammered by hail in 12 and 13, 10 was a very small vintage, and there was no hail, but it was very, very poor flowering, so they didn't have any quantity there either. And 11 was really the last vintage where you had average, and the last abundant vintage was 2009. So the cellars are empty there. So they're thinking, this 2014, this is great. And then comes the summer, which wasn't very good, but there, on the 28th of June, there was a massive hailstorm. Actually, it was a Saturday. There's an event called l'Élégance de Volnay. Some of you may have actually been there. If not, you should attend sometime. It actually is a great party. And to go there, I took the back road. I hate what's called the traffic circle, the périphérique in Beaune. I stay off of it whenever I can. And I took the back road that runs in front of the hospital. And when I was there, I was saying, wow, there must have been a tree trimming crew that came through going berserk, trimming everything in sight. And the farther I went, I began to realize, no, this is not tree trimmers, this is something that happened. And as I started to look closer, and then you could see the big hailstones that were still there that had just ravaged everything. And when I got to Volnay, the event is always held at Pousse d'Or, and they are famous for all their rose bushes, which are typically at the end of June, because the event is always held on the last Saturday of June. Usually the rose bushes are in full bloom. They're magnificent. There wasn't a petal to be seen. They were completely denuded. The mood of the growers, especially for the third year in a row, it was more like a funeral than it was a celebration of the wines of Volnay. That's just how violent the hailstorm was. If it was any good news, it was a bit of good news, bad news. Bad news was that it was more widespread than the hailstorm of 2013. The good news is that it wasn't quite as violent, even though it still did a lot of damage. Worse, there was wind with the hailstorm. And you might wonder what difference it would make. Well, the wind, when it's really blowing, is actually strong enough to blow the hailstones in from the side. And that means that the normal cover that you would get from the umbrella effect of the foliage, the canopy, didn't do any good. It got tattered, but it usually provides some benefit. But it came in from the side. And so it was really, really nasty because of that. In Volnay, Pommard, and Beaune, especially Pommard and Beaune, it was even worse because the hail basically started in Genévrières in Meursault, moved to the north, got all the way to the frontier of Savigny-les-Beaunes, reversed course, went back down to the border of Volnay, and then went north again all the way to Chambol. What that means is for those communes that got hit, which are basically Pommard and Beaune, they got hit twice because the same storm reversed course hit both sides of the Rose. There basically is no wine in Pommard and Volnay. It went all the way to Chambol, and the Côte de Nuit did much better than the Côte de Beaune. And you might say, well, same hailstorm, what's the difference? Well, the difference is that the Côte de Nuit wasn't pummeled in 2012 and 2013. I mean, vines are very, very tough. They're hardy, but they are nonetheless biological entities that you can only stress so much before you start to have secondary effects. And the fact that 2014 was the third traumatic event in a row caused a great deal of weakness in those vines. And so the guys in the Côte de Nuit viewed the hailstorm as almost what they call a vendange en vert, which is a green harvest. It's tongue-in-cheek, gallows humor, because it's not very precise, but they cut yields around 30%. But like I said, it was an abundant fruit set. So all it did in the Côte de Nuit was basically take yields back down to a normal level, and people probably would have dropped that fruit anyway. So ultimately, it really wasn't nearly as dramatic an event that it was in the Côte de Beaune. There, you never know what's going to happen with hail. Hail as a phenomenon, a weather phenomenon, is extremely precise, meaning that I've seen where the hail stops, and it's basically, you can have damage here in the back of the room, not much, and at the far back of the room, none. And you just never know about how the vicissitudes of a hailstorm and the way it moves, and part of that's due to the winds. But it is something that is redoubtable. There is no doubt about it, that if you go and you see the damage. And the other thing that you absolutely can't know in advance is how the vines will respond. In particular in Volnay and Pommard, Meursault to an extent, Beaune to an extent as well, they had been hit before, as I mentioned, and so the vines typically go into shock. I mean, it's big-time trauma, and in particular when the hail comes from the side, like I just described, that happened in 2014. Now the wood is being hit as well. So not only do you have an attack on the foliage, which is basically the way that a vine collects energy from the sun and transmits it to its cells, you also have an effect of structure. Now the vine, if it wasn't trellised, it would basically just die. And anyway, the upshot of all of this is that, much to everyone's surprise, the vines did actually recover after about 2.5 weeks. And so people were scared to death, because now we're fast forwarding a little bit, and our blow-by-blow story here is that conditions degraded in July. It became very, very rainy. It at least was cool. But nonetheless, the conditions were ideal for the rapid spread of rot, because when you have that much fruit that is split open, and even though you are a long, long way from veraison, you know, the moment where the fruit starts to turn color, you still have sugar in the grapes. And so that is an attraction for botrytis, rot, to attack. And when you have humid conditions like were extant in July, it was basically the ideal recipe to ravage everything else. And because what happens if you don't go out and treat really, really quickly is that the grapes that have split open now become rotten. They're in contact with grapes that aren't damaged, but the skins are such that they are permeable, and so it could have been a complete disaster, meaning that they could have lost the entire crop. Well, what happened, which is one of the bright aspects of it all, is that that didn't occur. Nobody really knows why, but it didn't. July turned out to be not very good. First half of August, not very good. And then conditions changed for the better. And this ultimately is what saved the vintage, because there is an old saying in Burgundy that août fait le mou, which is August makes the must. And September basically is the difference between, at least in most vintages, the difference between something that is mediocre and something that is excellent. Well, as it turns out, you basically had a period from the middle of August all the way to the beginning of November where conditions were very, very clement. You had a little bit of rain here and there, but not very much. There's one other nuance that came to the party in 2014 that hadn't been seen in a long, long time, and it is Drosophila, a little fruit fly that is known by the name of Suzuki because it's an Asiatic fruit fly, and it is responsible for causing what the Burgundians call acid rot, pourriture acétique for those of you that speak French. Anyway, what happened was it comes, and no one is quite certain. It's one of the biological mysteries that people are trying to solve. No one's quite certain whether it is the Drosophila themselves that infect the fruit, or whether their puncture wounds simply allow a bacteria to invade the fruit that's now has access from the exterior. Either way, it scares the hell out of people. Because if you look at what happened in Switzerland in 2014 or in Austria in 2014, huge swaths of, and they only attack red fruit. They don't seem to like Chardonnay or white berry fruits at all. But huge swaths were lost. And in Burgundy, while the damage ultimately wasn't enormous, it made people extremely nervous. Because all you got to do is walk out into a vineyard that's affected with, and right away you can smell it. You know, it's volatile acidity and then some. Like I said, it scares the hell out of people because it can spread like wildfire. And so what you had to do was to go out and remove the offending bunches and then remove them from the vineyard. There were some people that weren't very well informed, just went out and cut it off and threw it on the ground. Well, that doesn't do anything. And the riper the fruit becomes, the softer the skins become, and they become ever more vulnerable to the possibility of being infected. And so in the end, even though it didn't cause a great deal of damage, like I said, it made people very nervous. And here's the important part, because information that is interesting is one thing, information that tells you why things are the way they are in certain cases, is that it panicked people into picking too soon, because they were so afraid that they were going to either lose crop or have fruit that was badly rot tinged. Because it's very hard to pick that out. Now you can smell it, but when you've got thousands of berries in front of you, which one is the problem is very hard to figure out. If it's been there for a couple of days, you can see that it's flétri, which is wilted. And you can get rid of that. But anyway, it complicates growers' lives a great deal. And the only reason I go to such extremes to tell you all of this is that even though in the end it was much ado about not too much, I can tell you that if you go and you talk to the growers about this, they will tell you that they were going like this. And when your entire revenue for the year is sitting out in the field, I can tell you that it causes you to evaluate things differently. There's an old saying in Burgundy that you should have 3 vintages. And the first time I heard that, I said, what does that mean, 3 vintages? Well, as it turns out, the explanation is that you should have 1 vintage in the field, you should have 1 vintage in the cellar, and you should have 1 vintage in the bank. All of which is to say that if you have that vintage in the bank, then it enables you to take risk. But most of the things that will happen while your fruit is still in the field, other than getting perfectly ripe, isn't good. Predation, hail, rainfall, rot, there's all kinds of things that can happen. And like I said, all of those things, except for the conditions that permit perfect ripeness, are not good. And as a consequence, it takes some pretty good stones to sit there and wait when you're losing potentially 5% of your crop a day, and that 5% that you're losing may, unlike rot or something else that you can get rid of, may affect the quality of everything else. And so the point being that some of the 2014s that you'll taste may seem underripe, and there's a reason for that, because they got picked too soon. So when you run into it, now you know why. On the plus side, in the Côte de Beaune, the problem of the Suzuki was much, much less, for the simple reason that the bunches were much more aerated. These little fruit flies don't like wind. And so most of the parcels that were affected were either enclosed by walls, or next to buildings, someplace where there were a lot of elements to block the wind. And so in that sense, they were more affected. So I think just to bring it all together so we can get started and people can taste wines, the reason they came, is to say that 2014 is what I would call a very good vintage in red, an excellent vintage in white. But my sense of things based on what I hear, occasionally what I see when retailers send out offerings, other critics have written, is that I think it's a little underestimated in red and maybe a little overhyped in white. When I say a little overhyped, it's still an excellent vintage. One of the all-time greats? No, I don't think so, but it's certainly an excellent vintage. The red side, I like the vintage a lot. It is, I think, built for the midterm, just like I think the whites are built for the midterm. The acid spines are there, but they're not super firm. And so what do I mean by midterm relative to, say, a long-term vintage? On the red side, I would say you got Village wines in the 4 to 8 year range. You've got Premier Crus going 7 to 15, and you've got the Grand Crus basically at 12 years to 20. Contrast that with, say, 2005, where you can add 5 to 10 years to every one of those categories I just mentioned. That would be a vintage that was built for the very, very long term. There will be wines from 2005 that will see their 100th birthday with no trouble if the cork's good and the storage is good. So my point is that it's a lovely vintage. It is something that I think will be pleasurable to drink even young, even if it's not fully mature, because there's nothing in them to put you off. The other thing that I meant to mention about the harvest that is very, very important is that provided that people took care of the Suzuki affected fruit, it was super clean. And so you won't find aromatic deviations. I'm putting reduction aside because that's a discussion we could get into with respect to the whites, but assuming that the barrel was clean and so forth, there was nothing in the fruit itself that would lead you to have aromatic deviations. And so that's the other big, big plus that you didn't get in, say, 2012 or 2013 necessarily, is that you didn't have built-in problems. So that's another aspect that's a big plus with respect to the wines. Burgundy's genius is its diversity of terroirs, but as I'll get into about the specifics of each terroir, there are reasons why those terroirs don't all perform the same depending on the vintage. You can even talk about vintages that are relatively consistent and find that certain terroirs behave differently. If you get a super warm vintage, for example, that doesn't have much rainfall, think of vintages like 1990, 1976, or 2003, you will get some anomalies, like vineyards at the bottom of the slope where the clay, the soil is deeper, has got better water reserves, performing better than in wet vintages where all of a sudden things at altitude with relatively low soil depths perform better. And one of the reasons that I probably get an email a week from my base of subscribers asking, why don't you have a vintage chart? Well, the simple reality is I believe that vintage charts in Burgundy do more harm than good. Just as a kind of a tongue-in-cheek joke, I call Burgundy the land of the exception. Sort of like everything I'm about to say is mostly true, but if you dug around, you could find an exception. So with that little drum roll, 2014. If you want the Reader's Digest version, I would put it this way. Great start, great finish, really, really lousy middle. And how the terroirs reacted to those elements has a lot to do with what you'll find in the glass. At its best, 2014 is a classic Burgundian vintage, which is to say super fresh, very, very transparent to the underlying terroir, not super dense, but built for the medium term, and I would say built for the medium term in both reds and whites. Chassagne as a commune, I think, suffers from Pouligny and Meursault envy. And one of the things that they have done that I don't think is to the benefit of the reputation of the commune is to have transplanted so much of the commune from red to white. Now, economically, it made perfect sense to do that. When you look at ever since the Pouilly-Fuissé fad that occurred in the very early 1980s, where all of a sudden there wasn't enough white Burgundy in the world to satisfy the thirst, everybody said, let's get on the bandwagon. But you're not making excellent white wine. You are making something that you can get, like I said, you can charge more for it than you can red. But it is instructive, I think, to realize that as late as the 1970s, 70% of Chassagne was planted to Pinot. Today, 70% of it's planted to Chardonnay. Another curiosity here that you don't see in very many other places in Burgundy, with the exception of Chablis, which is that they have subsumed a great number of the climats underneath a primary climat. And the worst offender, or the biggest one, depending on your point of view as to whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Specificity is what Burgundy is about, and the less specificity there is, the less uniqueness there is, the less personality, the harder it is to say what something is or isn't. But Morgeau is the worst of the worst. All down here, you've got 26 different Ludis that could use the name Morgeau if they chose to. Now, there is, in defense, so that you don't walk out thinking that everybody in Chassagne is a money grubber, it makes sense if you take two of these and blend them together. And with the Napoleonic Code that occurred in 1804, and you took a really, really small area, and then within 3 generations, you chopped it up into little tiny pieces. Well, it is difficult for a lot of growers to have a commercially viable quantity such that they can sell it under the name of the Ludi. And so it became more commercially interesting to group it under something that everybody would recognize. So, you know, you get that in things like Vaillant, you get that in Fourchaume, you get that in Montmain, in Chablis, where you've basically taken vast areas. I mean, it's almost 5 kilometers, sorry, from one tip of Fourchaume to the other. Now, how you can have any sort of typicity with something that large, which is why when you ask somebody, what's Fourchaume? I bet if I went around the room, there's very few of you that could offer anything other than, well, when I had one, it was sort of like this. Well, that's not your fault. It's nobody's fault. There is no specificity, and that's the problem. And so you get into this,
Morgeau, we would all say fat, heavy, rich, but there are some excellent. You get up here, Vigne Blanche, which is there. You get up here, Grand Clos, Le Petit Clos. This is where, for example, Drouhin's comes from. Ferrand is excellent. But basically, you're talking about Ludis that are above the route that leads down to Fontenay. But when you put everything in the kitchen sink into the same basket, like I said, you lose that sense of specificity. Here you have Maltois. And Maltois has 4 Ludis grouped underneath it. So you have this, you have Chassagne, which drives everybody nuts because the whole commune is named Chassagne. You have Easy Crête and Les Places. These are not all the same. Most of the better makers are in this, like Nilon is there, Jean-Noël Gagnard, certain others. This particular example comes from here. It's a blend of Easy Crête and Les Places. Heights-Lochardet is a budding superstar. There's 2 reasons for that, because no matter how good you are, if you don't have really excellent terroir to work with, it's very hard to build a reputation for yourself. But it is an historic old domain that was leased out. Its vineyards were leased out for many, many, many years. They are now slowly coming back. There are, France being France, there are regulations for everything. One of them is that you must be a trained winemaker and not just going next door and having your uncle say, this is what we used to do. You're actually talking a degree and the willingness to then take over the domain. And so as the various leases come due, they will return to the domain. So they now have Chevalier, not bad for a Grand Cru. They're going to have more vineyards that come back over the next 5 years. It's a domain to watch. He's using whole cluster on the red side. He's not afraid to take on that challenge. I like what he does a lot. He's still young, and so everything he does is not going to be perfect. But nonetheless, it's a domain to watch. In terms of what you get from a stylistic standpoint, Maltois, just like down here, is all about the harvest date. You have to have a good sense of not only analytically, because anybody can go out and pick grapes, take a sample, send it over to the lab, look at the total acidity, the kind of acidity, the sugar levels, taste it, but ultimately no one has yet figured out how to determine the right level of phenolic ripeness that you're looking for in the context of a given vintage. And that is what makes the great winemakers great, is that they seem to have an innate sense of what the fruit is capable of giving. But here's the real nuance. People ask me still all the time, even though the man's been dead since 2006, why was Jaillet so great? Or what is it about Christophe Roumier that makes him so good? And I think that it is not only this innate understanding of what the fruit is capable of, but here's the key, in my opinion, what it's not capable of. But ultimately, the reason that Burgundy has had a fascination for more than 1,000 years now, I mean, think of how long Claude Bèze in 640 has intrigued people. That's a long, long time. And that has transcended generation after generation after generation of winemakers. So it's not a single winemaker that's doing anything special in Claude Bèze. Claude Bèze has something to say. And I think that is the respect that ultimately keeps people coming back to look again and again and again to have that personal connection. Some people like bold. Some people like me prefer finesse. Neither one of us are wrong. But it takes quite a few examples of something from different hands and different vintages to learn what you're likely to get. And that's what makes connoisseurship in Burgundy. Each commune has a grower syndicate. And they get together, and it's usually some blend of historical tradition that said that these, like for example, these two, that Heights-Lochardet is using, Crête and Les Places, were always called Maltois. There is, in spite of the fact that these Ludis were established over the better part of 1,000 years, and certainly for the last couple of hundred, these were always sold as Maltois. And so one of the things that is super, super, super important is Burgundy is tradition. There's probably nothing more. And so, there's a lot of climats in Echizeau, for example, that were sold as Echizeau. And so when they got around in 1935 to establishing the actual appellations, they said, well, that's historical precedent, we'll accept that. So as long as it is decreed by Inao, Inao is it's INAO, and everybody just calls it Inao. And it is the governmental body that regulates all things vinous in France. You can go to their website and look up any terroir, and they will give you, it's in French, but they will give you the exact decree as to what's permissible. Okay, Pouligny. There is no place on the planet that makes better dry white wine than here. Certainly not on a Chardonnay basis anyway. Have all the Riesling people upset with me. There are, for such a small commune, it's easily the smallest of what I call the big three, which are Meursault and Chassagne. There are an enormous number of expressions here when you get big and rich, but extremely classy down here. Perrier, which is right next to it, makes incredibly, like the name would suggest, Perrier meaning small stones. It is very, very stony. This is where all of Henri Boileau's great work comes from. Then you move to Clairvoyant, which is perfectly good, but rarely anything exciting. And then Pucelle, which a lot of people, not me, but a lot of people would say is the best in the entire commune, being that it's an extension basically of Bâtard and Bienvenue. I think the best is right there, Cailleret. Because it's a direct extension of Montrachet, but it also combines, I think, what Pouligny does best, which is class, minerality, vibrancy, and ability to age for years and years and years. Not that ageability is necessarily a criterion that should be there for greatness, but typically the greatest wines that most of us have ever tried are those with some age. The largest and best known is Folatière. But as I mentioned earlier, as soon as you introduce size, you get variability. And Folatière is one of these where down here is the best. Up here, in spite of the fact that you would think higher up would be more interesting for whites, not necessarily the case in Folatière. In particular, here we're in Changuin. By the way, the Burgundians are not very good with respect to one aspect, and that's spelling. You will see every variation under the sun. Inao is actually trying to enforce through something that is sort of the equivalent of the local real estate guide, which are called the cadastres, the spelling that should be used. But they also have had the suppleness to apply it where, as long as the consumer isn't being misled, then it's permissible. The date of the harvest is the single most important variable that a vigneron has to decide on. And down here, you're given to what the French call surmaturité, which is over mature. You get those exotic aromas, kind of fat, fleshy, low acid wines, versus up here, where all of a sudden now you're exposed to the wind. Ripening patterns are much delayed. It's not at all the same wine. So it is a terroir that is hard to generalize about. I don't think it is one of the most interesting ones, but it is one that is worth knowing because you'll see it a lot. Like I said, it's the second largest Premier Cru there. Speaking of really, really old vineyards, we just came upon one here. This has been planted. The first reference that we have been able to find is 1110. So this vineyard has been planted since 1110, maybe before that, but at least since 1110. And what's interesting, given that Clos Vougeot, here you've got this 50.5 hectare monstrosity of a vineyard that can be great, often isn't, but it's all red. As far as anyone knows. And the other interesting thing is that even since the French Revolution in 1789, it has never been divided up. What's interesting is that the monks probably because they had so much red wine. They thought, some white wine, a little, summer sipper would be good to have. Where you have so much red is that a lot of these are planted to white. It makes really, really good white because there's not much clay and a whole lot of limestone. So the one by Vougeret, for example, is extremely interesting, ages well. They make it in a style that is relatively accessible young, but it actually ages surprisingly well. Boisset, which is sort of the Gallo of Burgundy, meaning in terms of just size, it's actually traded on a stock exchange. They bought in a lot of domains as well as négociants, and they had the idea to let's consolidate all our domains that actually have holdings and make sort of a super domain. And they converted it all to biodynamic farming. Pierre Vincent uses a fair amount of whole cluster, but their holdings are remarkably good. And I think that they've decided to, in a sort of a vast sea of mediocrity, because most of their stuff is frankly not very interesting. But in Vougeret itself, Vincent has carte blanche to keep the yields low and to make the wines to last. They are serious wines. And anyway, one of the things that I've talked to him about, because oak is not my thing, is to say that your wines are too woody for me. Now, again, I'm not trying to be the czar of taste. Some people like wood, but I think it gets in the way because when wood sweetens the finish, at that point you've changed the texture of the wine, and that's too much. And whether he agreed with me or thought it was a good idea, they changed. The Hill of Courton actually goes across 3 different communes. It's 175, 180 hectares in total at the Grand Cru level. In terms of Courton-Charlemagne, there are 71 hectares. There are 10 different Ludis that have the right to Courton-Charlemagne. But up here, you have the possibility of 3 different Grand Cru whites. I'm willing to bet that when I say the third one, there's no one here that's even heard of it, which is hard to do, a Grand Cru that nobody's heard of in Burgundy. There's Courton Blanc, which means that any of these, and we're only looking at Alos here, but we have La Doire there and Pernon there, and they have obviously Grand Crus in them as well. But anything here that's in the Rosé, that's planted a Chardonnay, becomes Courton Blanc. If that's what you want to declare it as. You can declassify. Anything here can be classified as Courton-Charlemagne or Charlemagne. Most people have never heard of Charlemagne because it rarely ever gets used. Jadot, for example, declared one in 1993. They declared another one in 2002. And you might ask, well, why would you do that when Courton-Charlemagne is obviously much, much better known than Charlemagne? And the reason is that they are actually an owner here in Puget, and that's a domain wine for them. And they were able to buy some en Charlemagne. In case if you want a mnemonic device as to how to tell them apart, there's Le Charlemagne here, which is Alos. En Charlemagne is here in Pernon, and there's only 1 Ludi in Pernon that qualifies. There are 5 here, including the very top part of Renard, and then there are 4 over here in La Doire. The point being is that they were able to acquire some en Charlemagne from a very, very good source, and to make sure that they didn't have confusion between the domain wine of Courton-Charlemagne, they used the little-known appellation of Charlemagne. Still a Grand Cru, still Courton-Charlemagne, or it could be declared as Courton-Charlemagne, but they used it to make a distinction. And in fact, Vougeret, in 2014, is going to declare a Courton-Charlemagne, Charlemagne. And so for those of you that follow Vougeret, you'll see that. And it's kind of interesting. So this particular one, let's see, where are we here? Is from here. It's on the Pernon side. And this is where exposition makes a big, big difference, and where how a terroir performs in a given vintage really comes into play. Over here, Le Droit is due east. And so if you get Corton Charlemagne coming from here, Fébelise, for example, is from there. You get something that in a cold vintage is great because it's got the most amount of sunshine. In here, this is all basically south. And so you're getting not the early morning sun, but you're getting the midday sun and the evening sun. Here, for example, Christophe Roumier, Rapé, a lot of people, because this is fully 17 hectares over here. And this is where Mark O'Connell's wine comes from. This is due west. It is not great exposition in most vintages, but take an extreme vintage like 2003 or 2009 where things got really, really ripe. The best Corton Charlemagne came from there. Coches, for those of you that are just interested in that, comes right here, mid-slope, Le Charlemagne. But they give different expressions. And to your question earlier about how you would know what comes from what, again, you just have to have a resource that lists it. I try in all cases to list where they come from. In a lot of vintages, the harvest date would probably be the most important thing. But in more extreme vintages, either really, really cool vintages or really, really warm vintages, where you are with 71 hectares, it makes a difference. Savigny, one of my favorite value communes, where you can get excellent quality reds. They make good whites too, but it's much better known for reds. If you've never been to Burgundy, my guess is that your sense of the topography is that you've got this unbroken hillside that runs from just south of Dijon and Chenauve all the way down to the Marange. Nothing could be farther from the truth. And the reason is that most of the vineyards are situated on hillsides that run from almost due north to east, to south, and like I just mentioned in Pernon-Vergelès, almost west. Now that's rare in Burgundy, but most of it is either some combination of northeast, southeast, rather than something as extreme as west. But why does it do that? Well, the answer is that when the topography of the Côte d'Or was created some 10 to 12,000 years ago, it was due to the action of glaciers. Not the glaciers themselves, but the runoff from the glaciers. And so each summer, when it warmed up, the glaciers would melt incredible amounts of water, and they, like gravity still worked back then, all that water flowed downhill and created what are called combes or veils. And these combes are what separate the intersection of one hillside from another. And besides simply being, in certain cases, a very, very dramatic geological feature of the landscape, they have very, very real effects on ripening levels. Why? Because cool air flows down at night. And so where you are, where your vineyards are in relation to those combes has a lot to do with the ripening characteristics of whether something's precocious or, as the French say, tardif, meaning very, very late ripening. It also, nothing happens in viticulture without a compromise. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. One of the things you might say, well, given what you said about risk, agricultural risk and economic risk of having to wait to pick, well, one of the things that you get out of that, though, is airflow. And airflow is typically really, really good for preventing rot. And so, for example, if you have perspiration on your arm and you're driving, put your arm outside, 30 seconds later, it's all gone. Well, it's the same thing that happens because usually in the morning there's dew on the fruit. Yeah, that wind blows. Guess what? It's not there anymore. And so the more exposed you are to the wind is good on the one hand in that you tend not to have rot. Also, None of those vineyards had any trouble with Suzuki fly in 2014 because, like I said, the little fruit flies can't navigate in the wind. On the other hand, if you look at like the Côme de Lavaux, where all of the best Gevrey Premier Crus are situated, those are super, super late harvesting. And there are times when that's not good. Especially if you're in October, like I said, those days start to get shorter and shorter and shorter. And so your ability to get adequate phenolic ripeness can be impaired. Anyway, my point is that Cômes are a name that you will see again and again and again incorporated into the vineyards. Côme d'Orvaux, which is actually a village, a Chambolle Premier Cru, and it's actually one of the three climats in Musigny. There are lots and lots of vineyards that have Côme in the name. For strict value, 2014 is the best vintage I've seen in a long, long time for the Haute Côte. And so when you see Bourgogne, Haute Côte de Beaune, or Bourgogne, Haute Côte de Nuits, those are worth checking out in 2014. I would say the other side, though, in 2013, out of probably more than 100, I recommended exactly one in 2013. The rot was massive. Right here, you have two Cômes, and the reason that Guet is it's also what they call a split rated, by the way, meaning that a portion of it is rated as Village and a portion is in Premier Cru. The Clos des Guet is a segment within Guet here, which is over here. And there are only three owners, Jadot being one of them. Guet is one of these Premier Crus that, in spite of the fact that it is protected partially here, but this, if you could see it, there's a tree line right here. But this is a big Côme, this is a big Côme, but it's protected from those winds. It still tends to pick relatively late, and because it's at altitude, you have to wait to enjoy these. Guet can be tough when it's young. So you need low yields and you need ripeness. If you don't have it, you're not going to have something that is very interesting. Savigny as a commune is pretty easy to understand. I mean, basically, you just have two sides. This is over here next to Beaune. And you can have a lot of different expressions in Savigny. Pouillet, where this is the road leading in, and this is the autoroute that runs right up here. And Pouillet, because it's all sandy, tends to be sort of light, fruity, easy. It always drinks well young. Probably the most representative Savigny is Lavière here. It's the biggest, but it also is excellent. If you want to experience what Savigny has to offer, try something from Bise, try something from Pavelot. The best is probably, it's called Les Jarons, but it's, there's a little section within Les Jarons called La Dominaude. And I would say that's probably the best. Try it from Bruno Clair or Jadot to see what another expression of Savigny. There's a tendency, especially because of Serpentière, because it's also large. Serpentière is like Pouillet, tends to be fruity, easy, accessible. Not to say banal, by the way, just they're lighter. But you can have, when you look at a good Lavière or a Guet, or a Gravin here, or certainly Vergelès or Dominaude or Norberton. I mean, you can get some wines that will easily reward 10 to 15 years of cellaring. Not that they necessarily need it, but they will certainly give you a very, very different expression than you would get with something like Pouillet or Serpentière, which I said tends to be lighter, fruitier, a little more easygoing. Camille Giroux, David Croix. One of my favorite people in Burgundy. Not only is he extremely talented, but he's a very, very bright guy, very thoughtful, reflective. I would highly recommend visiting him if you have the chance to go. Not only will you see a broad range of terroirs, but you have somebody that's really dialed in. This whole band down here of Volnay, which, by the way, is my personal fave in the Côte de Beaune in terms of communes, because the expressions are so different. You've got a relatively small commune, but the expressions that you can have in Volnay are incredible in terms of the differences. You've got this sector up here, which tends to be mineral-driven, austere. Anybody that's had a good D'Angeville-Clos-des-Ducs will know exactly what I'm talking about. That character is then transferred here to Taillepied, that I think is hugely underappreciated, partially because it's austere, always austere young. Needs a lot of bottle age to come around. Then you have the largest of them, Claude Chêne, which is a Volnay of power. For those of you that are familiar with Lafarge's, who I think is the reference standard for that particular vineyard, it actually comes from right down here. And it is a little bit atypical, but as you move up slope here, the soil gets very, very white. And then you're down here with Cailleret, which most people would agree, certainly the historical authors that have opined on the quality of the vineyards in Volnay would tell you that Cailleret is the best of the best. Chevret, you get finesse, minerality, some power, and then you get down to this band right here, and now you get wines that are very round, supple. You don't get the minerality that you tend to get up here, or certainly not up here. They tend to all be split rated. You can see right here that Luray, in fact, 75% of the vineyard is actually classified as village. The clay gets much deeper. The stones get bigger. They're less fine. Luray is what I would call sort of the golden retriever of Volnay, where it's always very nice, elegant. We're not talking rustic here, but we are talking round, relatively easy to appreciate things that need no more than, in the average vintage, no more than 5-6 years. But by the way, one of the things that I would suggest to you is that Volnay, a little bit like Chambol, there's the idea that everything is sweetness, light, and lace in Volnay. That's not true. You come down here, you're getting some robust, even rustic wines. And so knowing where your Volnay village, bless you, where your Volnay village comes from, because the expression that you get down here versus up here is literally night and day. This is all mineral, has a lot of difficulty getting ripe. It's best to buy these in the riper vintages. Down here, it's best to buy them not so much in ripe vintages or cool vintages, but in vintages that aren't wet. For example, 2012, 2013, or even 11, 12, and 13, if there was a defining element, it's rain. And these tend not to be so wonderful in vintages that are wet. Why? Because the clay is heavy, doesn't drain. I've been here where you see ducks floating around because the more that they've built up the road here, doesn't drain like it used to. And it's a big problem in the coat. This is another place where you can find value. But the reason that I think that Pommard has fallen out of fashion, because if you read the old authors, Pommard was the commune in the Côte du Beaune. It was more famous than Volnay. In fact, even today, Négociant Pommard sells for more than Volnay. It's hard to believe. Again, there's a lot of expressions. You really, in spite of the fact that this looks a little bit like Savigny, by the way, that's a huge comb right there, and they've built a road that goes up. There's another one here. There's a third one there. But it's, in terms of the expressions, it's not as easy to say south, north. This is Beaune over here. This is Volnay. You obviously have Rougienne, which tends to be robust, powerful mineral. But where in Rougienne, Rougienne Bas versus Rougienne Haut makes a lot of difference. This is all affected by the comb. It's almost Volnaysienne as opposed to really Pommard-like. Claude Verger is a bit of an exception. But these right here tend to be rich, velvety. This is where Grand Epinot, Petit Epinot, where this particular one comes from is actually right here. It is 80%, 90% really, Petit Epinot. It's got a little slice of Grand Epinot in it. Leave it to the Burgundians to make sure you're confused, because Petit Epinot is 5 hectares larger than Grand Epinot. And the reason that they did it was actually that the length of the vine rows. Because you see this, it's Petit Epinot as well. Given that they're planted east-west, the rows here are much longer than they were here, and they still named it Grand versus Petit. The more that you move towards Beaune, the wines from Epinot get lighter. This is really the sweet spot. And in my view, the Clos des Epinot is the best Epinot. But you get a very, very different expression than over here for the most part. Certainly Chanlin. But what you get is a wine that is able to age for a very, very long time. Gevrey. Here's the biggest combe in the entire côte, right here. It's called the Combe de Lavaux. If you look right there, they named a vineyard after it as well, but it's the Combe de Lavaux. There are 26 Premier Crus in the commune of Gevrey. There's 9 Grand Crus and 69 village level vineyards. But this combe right here is huge. And you can see that right here, Lavaux Saint-Jacques is dead in the middle. This is the latest picking vineyard in all of Gevrey. And the difference, like Eric Rousseau, for example, says that between Claude Bèze and Lavaux, you can have 10 days of difference. That just tells you the effect of the winds and the cool air that I was talking about on ripening patterns. One of the effects of the combe, a secondary effect, it's going to sound like I'm a geography professor here, but they are big alluvial fans. And you might say, with the exception of Moret-Saint-Denis and Chorey-les-Beaunes, they're the only ones that have any material amount of vineyards on what's called the wrong side of the tracks, the other side of the Route Nationale here. And it's because so much material was brought down by those glacial flows that it spread out. And you can see how basically it did this. And the quality of that earth was so high that a lot of this wound up being classified as village level. And there are actually 7 different ludis that make up this particular blend, 5 of which are over here. This particular one, Symphony, is meant to be drunk young. But Gevrey is another commune where just the village level vineyards alone constitute 360 hectares. Do the math, that's 1,000 acres. So you get hugely different expressions. Also, what this map doesn't include is that this commune right here is Brochon, and Brochon makes Côte-Nouille village, Bourgogne, but there are 11 ludis in Brochon that actually have the right to be declared as Gevrey. And a lot of people would argue, especially the people who own vineyards there, that the best Gevrey village comes from Brochon. Tends to be more classic Gevrey, lots of minerality, power, but they require time to come around. Marcenay-la-Côte. This actually is 3 communes. It's a bit like the hill of Corton, where you have Chenauve over here, and then there's Marcenay-la-Côte in the middle. Where we are focused is right here. It is the only vineyard that's in Chenauve. It's the smallest of the 3, as you can see by far, even though Clos du Roi is a very, very large climat or vineyard at 24 hectares. There are a lot of people that make Clos du Roi, but most people, myself included, would argue that the very best Marcenay vineyard is right there, Clos du Roi. The second best is right there, Langerois. It's not an accident either. These two, I believe that unlike the effort to have Rougienne and Epinot declared as Grand Crus or upgraded to Grand Crus, I think that's a long shot. The effort in Marcenay, though, to have some number of Premier Crus, I think that will succeed. And while there's a great deal of debate as to which of them will merit being included as Premier Crus, what I think is absolutely, if anybody, or if any of them make it, those 2 will absolutely be Premier Crus. Clos du Roi is, in fact, the growers, because they badly want the upgrade, have made so much effort that you almost wonder today how they were ever missed being classified on their own right. Because this appellation has only existed since '87. It's remarkable to think.
that for a long time it made rosé, light fruity wine that was sold in the cafes of Dijon. But they've made so much effort now that you get age-worthy, mineral-driven wines. They're not warm and cuddly. If they're vinified correctly, these are wines that require time. Sylvain Pataille, by the way, is a consultant to many of the very, very best domains in Burgundy. The guy is a whiz, but the guy is really, really gifted. Uses a high high proportion of whole cluster, makes wines that are meant to age. And his Cuvée Centenaire is a very, very special wine. Chambolle and Pascal Meunieret. Actually, it's Gerard Meunieret, but Pascal is his son. This is a domain that has for years and years and years made wine that consistently confound people. It's a bit like the, for those of you that were fans of Jacques Truchot's wines when he was making them, it's the same sort of thing where they are deceptively light. I've had a lot of older Meunieret wines that have aged brilliantly. One of the interesting things about the style is that it is relatively accessible young, but actually amply repays long keeping. But the nice thing about it is it's not necessary. So they're not built to need lots of time, but they will age, and they age on a basis of balance. We've now just come upon what, in my opinion, is the single most complicated appellation in all of Burgundy. Charmes is the largest of them. And it's interesting, one of the reasons why Chambolle for years and years sort of remained in the shadows, at least at a Premier Cru level, even though Bonnemar and Musigny were never in the shadows, is because they're so small. There's only one other Premier Cru larger than 5 hectares, and that's Amoureuse. And there are 8 that are less than a hectare. And so you can't build a reputation when there's no wine available. And so the other thing that happened is a bit like I mentioned in Morgeau, where you have little tiny parcels, they tend to be blended. And so you still see on the marketplace plenty of anonymous Chambolle Premier Cru with no Ludi listed on the label, and that's because the only way that they can have a commercially viable quantity is to blend. Charmes 30 years ago would have been considered probably the number 2 vineyard after Amoureuse. Today, I think it's still considered to be very good, but my sense is, certainly in my view, is that it's not Les Cras and Fouet, because you have Christophe Roumier and Fred Meunier making those wines, along with Ghislaine Barteau and a number of other very, very gifted winemakers. So I get the sense that Charmes' reputation has gone back a little bit and has been supplanted by Fouet, Cras, Sentier, Baude, certain others, even Audois. Bornic and Chabillot can be very interesting too. The problem is that nobody has very much, and so they tend to be négociant wines. Nuits Saint-Georges is not an easy commune to understand, partially because it's larger, and partially because what you get from different segments of Nuits Saint-Georges can be very, very different. The section that a lot of people focus on is called a section Vaunois, meaning that it is close to Vosne-Romanée over here. And the vineyards, especially Boudot, Damod, Meurget, that's where I was talking about, where you got the big pile of stones and everything. For those of you that are familiar with the Clos de Maréchal from Fred, that tends to be a relatively elegant nouilles, and it's not an accident. Because the soils down there, with the exception of what I was mentioning with the Clos de Poré Saint-Georges, which, by the way, is right there, it's less that way. Or from the Arlo wines, where you can get the Clos l'Arlo, which is extremely elegant.
anyway, you get very, very different expressions once again, depending on where you are. This is relatively, this is several kilometers from here all the way to the south side of Prémaux. One of the interesting things about Prémaux is that you have 8 clos and 7 monopoles, which is very, very unusual in such a small area, because this is not very big in Prémaux. But so the classic section here, where you get that Van de Garde, robust, rustic. Say what you want about Les Saint-Georges, but elegant is not typically a term that I use to describe it. It's not super rustic either. It lasts a gazillion years, but needs a lot of time. Grape growing and winemaking wasn't, in 1855, was not really a métier, meaning it wasn't really a career path. You didn't put all your economic eggs in one basket because it wasn't profitable for the most part. So people practiced what was called polyculture, meaning that they had chickens, they had some wheat, they had fruit trees. In the Côte d'Or in the past, you look at the old photos, you will almost always see fruit trees out in the vineyards, because you could get a horse under there, you can't get a tractor under there. So now most of them have been yanked out. So you have all these little things, but most of the landowners were little guys, but they couldn't make enough wine to make it profitable for them. And the reason that Burgundy, from the earliest days after the French Revolution, very rapidly became the land of the négociant, was I could buy from you, from you, from you, from you, and from you. I could combine it and make a commercially viable quantity. And so out of the 4 steps of, if you want to just be very, very simplistic for a moment, out of the 4 steps that are necessary to put a bottle of wine on a consumer's table, is that you had the viticulture, which was done by the domain owner, the winemaking, I should say the vinification, which was done by them. The négociant then came, picked up the brand new wine in a barrel that typically they provided, and they would do the élevage, and then they would do the bottling and commercialization. They developed the commercial networks to do that. And so you had this division, in a way, of church and state that persisted up until phylloxera. And then things started to change because the négociants began to abuse the system, where they still had thirsty clients that wanted Burgundy, but there was no wine in Burgundy. And so they went south to Morocco, to Algeria, and even into southern France, where the vineyards were reconstituted much earlier than they were in Burgundy. And you had the development of a railway system called the PLM, which was the Paris-Lyon Méditerranée. Most people think it's Marseille, but it's actually Méditerranée. And so all of a sudden you had transport that could effectively and cheaply move big quantities of wine in tankers. And so they would arrive in Beaune, down d'Agerie, they'd take that off, Richebourg. Guess what? It was a lot more profitable to do that than to try and make wine from the pitiful quantities that had survived the attacks of phylloxera. But it also meant that they drove so many people out of business that there were riots, and that eventually led to the establishment of the AOC system, whose primary goal was to prevent the abuse of controlled place names. Just to give you a brief overview of Vosne Romanée, you have 2.5 Premier Crus that are actually on the Flagey side, because Beaumont is actually split almost in 2. Half of it's on the Vosne side, half of it's on the Flagey side. And you also have Les Rouges and En-Orvaux. And En-Orvaux is where another big combe is, and they call it the Combe d'Orvaux. And that is, I mentioned earlier, one of the climats that, the 3 climats that makes up Musigny. You also have 11 climats here that make up Échezeaux. In any event, out of the 17, depending on whether you count Combe d'Orvaux separately or not, a lot of people just dump it into Brûlé. Whether you say there's 16 or 17 of the Vosne Premier Crus, they are, once again, fantastically different depending on where. If you had to choose just one to say quintessential Vosne, it'd be Souchot, because it's the biggest. It also is a little bit like the Clos des Epinaux in that You have something that's round, extremely spicy, seductive. It matures into something incredibly rich. It's not my favorite, but I think that because it's the largest and because it tends to make very, very seductive wines, if you just did a general poll of people who have some familiarity, they might very well choose Choucho. I think the wines that come from up here, Petit-Mont, Regnault, Croparentou, Malconsor, are much more interesting because of the minerality. Down here, while I'm sure that Michel Gros would be very annoyed at me of saying that this isn't his monopole, Claude Rayat, that's not the best section any more than the lower section of Choucho. I didn't really realize it until I was up in a helicopter looking at this, but this goes like this, and the water collects, and it either overproduces or it rots. You don't have that problem up here. And so the best section of Choucho is up here. Anyway, moving to this area right here, this is a road, literally, that splits Brulé into two. And here you get something that's counterintuitive, because normally a north-facing, because you have, again, this, where you have this sort of concavity right here, you have that in Brulé as well. And you would think, intuition would tell you that the south-facing side here would be more powerful and riper than this section. It's not the case. Why? I can't tell you, but I've wondered for a long, long time. Virgile Ligné, I think, is a guy on the rise. Uses a lot of whole cluster, which I happen to like. Makes wines from both Clossany and Claude Laroche. You should definitely check out his Faconnière. That is sort of a Claude Laroche, I don't want to say on the cheap, but you get most of what you get with the Grand Cru, a little more minerality even, ages extremely well. Anyway, I think what Virgile does is really spectacular. So he's worth checking out if you like wines that are neither super austere, but certainly not light. He builds them to last. So with that, are we basically done? Okay, then I'd like to simply thank you very much for your kind attention. I hope I didn't throw too much, but I enjoyed doing it. So I hope you guys had a good time too. So thank you very much.